Welcome, everybody. My name is Edward Roske. In addition to being CEO here at interRel, I am also your educator slash entertainer for the next hour. We're going to be talking about how to take a company, an organization, an economy, a world's shift from looking backward where things react to us, responding in the moment of a pandemic, to looking forward to what that proactive world is going to look like. So pause for a moment. Let's just go ahead and get this out of our system and ask yourself, on a scale of, let's roughly go 1 to 10, how far off was your 2020 budget? You know what? Go as high as 20 on that scale of 1 to 10. Because for most of us, it was like throwing darts at a dartboard, and we were all really, really bad at playing that game. We knew what number we wanted, and we knew what number we started the year with, and we had an absolutely horrendous job of actually hitting those numbers. And we kept revising it. It was almost like the scoreboard, the dartboard was just moving, like whenever we threw them. On March 2nd, 2020, I felt that coronavirus, this whole COVID-19 thing, could turn out to be serious, and that companies needed a plan for potential impacts. But I said it could also be much ado about absolutely nothing. So let's look back at 1 year ago. It's hard to really appreciate, hard to imagine how much has changed. So please try not to laugh at my babe in the woods innocence. Suffice to say, we were all blissfully ignorant at the start of March 2020, and I was no different. So I came up with this idea, hey, we should do a webcast. And I felt that companies should prepare for both ways. Like in the FP&A world, I said, let's prepare one way. What if this is all hype? What if it's going to blow over? What if it also turned out to be really bad? So I hurriedly put together this webinar that I called Coronavirus and Its Impact on FP&A. And this is what the abstract said for that webcast that I delivered on, keep this date in mind, March 11th, 2020, 1 year ago tomorrow. Start by having a look at that first paragraph of that adorably naive webcast abstract from 365 days ago. Will novel coronavirus, COVID-19, end up being a panic or a pandemic? Intriguingly, the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic on March 11th, literally the day I delivered the webcast, which meant I had to do a lot of last-minute changing to my presentation because of that one. Second line, stocks already falling. Stocks did not just fall. For a while, they were back to the levels that they were at the end of the Obama presidency. It was like we lost all economic gains for an entire 4-year period. Industries didn't just lose billions, they lost over $7 trillion in valuation at one point. International travel is limited. How about I can't even fly to Canada right now? All travel, all events got locked up. We've all been working at home, some of us a year later. Shoppers in affected areas are seeing some empty shelves. For a while, the majority of shops were not only empty, they were shuttered. Look at all the major retail and restaurant corporations that have gone bankrupt over the last year. So I was hoping for the best a year ago, but I was planning for the worst. And the question rather rapidly morphed from, will coronavirus have an impact on business, to how severe will that impact be and how long will it last? I'm going to take you through a few just quick headlines because I delivered a series of webcasts over the month of March as the situation kept changing. So I was able to go back to those webcasts and grab some kind of fun headlines from the time. Yeah, a lot happened in March last year. This was an article on slate.com from March 4th. Some parts of this article did not age well. Here was the opening paragraph. There are many compelling reasons to conclude that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is not nearly as deadly as is currently feared, but COVID-19 panic has set in nonetheless. You can't find hand sanitizer in stores, and face masks are being sold online for exorbitant prices. This is the fun part. Never mind that neither is a good way to protect against the virus. Yes, just wash your hands. The article goes on to talk about how the likely mortality rate is between 0.1 and 0.2%. But we had counterpoint. That same day, Harvard Business Review started advocating for scenario planning, God's bless them, on March 4th. They had this article titled, What Coronavirus Could Mean for the Global Economy. This article did age, actually very well. It argued in this article that all pandemics dating back to the Spanish flu, if coronavirus should turn out to be a pandemic, all of them resulted in a very steep, what's called a V-shaped recession. So remember that term V-shaped recession? We're going to be talking about that a bit more later. This article, coronavirus could force teams to work remotely. This came out also in Harvard Business Review. This was on March 6th, and it said, hey, maybe we just all might need to work at home for a little while and be aware of what that might look like. Plan for being out of the office for a couple of weeks. 3 days later, analysts started saying, we might see a recession if this thing isn't over by the end of April. Later that same day, on March 9th, McKinsey said we should plan for 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, the quick recovery, back to normal by Q2. Second scenario, global slowdown, back to normal by Q3. Third situation, pessimistic, global pandemic and recession. That will not return us to normal until possibly November of 2020. And what we now know, looking back at what they said on March 9th, even their most pessimistic of the scenarios wasn't bad enough. 2 days after that is when the World Health Organization said, yep, we're in a pandemic, and look at the impact it has. I liked this one because we were like, oh, well, maybe the pollution's going to get better. That'll be good if we shut down all global manufacturing and factory production. So notice the left side was what Wuhan looked like at the start of the year, and this right side is what Wuhan looked like in February. I personally did a survey of 100 plus multi-billion-dollar companies that same day on March 11th and said, yep, World Health Organization says we're in a global pandemic. How do you think this is going to affect your revenue and your profit? 38% said their profitability would not be affected at all by COVID-19. 39% said, yeah, maybe somewhat decrease, but we don't really think it'll be that big of an impact. I took this screenshot on March 9th. This is for the whole world. And the world at that point had just over 100,000 cases, 130,605, and it had 4,000 deaths. Intriguingly, the US had just over 600. They actually had 605 cases at that point. Here's a snapshot at the end of March. This is just for the United States. So by the end of that month, the USA alone had more than 165,000 cases, and the USA alone had over 3,000 dead. In 22 days, the US went from barely a blip on the global scale to the most cases in the world, a number we still have not relinquished. So what did companies around the world do? Well, the smart ones, the ones that realized this was going to be a big deal, they reacted. They reacted immediately by starting to update their plans. FP&A dropped everything, and they tried to forecast what the future was going to look like, what the impact of COVID was going to be on their expected revenue, how they were going to have to control their expenses, what their liquidity was going to be like. How fast they were able to react depended on how they did budgeting. The companies that had the hardest time changing their plans were the ones that budgeted the traditional way, planning lots and lots of dollar amounts, generally entering into massive forms, a process that takes months. And as such, most of those companies generally did that big budget once per year. Dollars, or whatever your local currency happens to be, those are outputs. They're key reporting indicators. They are not key leading indicators. So many of these companies couldn't quickly go into their budget and start changing numbers. So we saw many people with this type of planning system unable to get their budgets revised into April or even longer. Many just pulled all their budget guidance all together and told Wall Street and all the other markets, we have to admit, we have no idea what's going to happen. Companies with driver-based plans were a bit better off. At least in their cases, they could modify those key leading indicators and let them flow through their whole forecast. Sadly, many of these plans only allowed for a single set of numbers, a single scenario. So they would change their drivers, and that would output a single revised forecast, a single income statement. Then those companies would wait until those numbers turned out to be wrong, and then they would revise it and output a single forecast. And they would keep revising it every time it turned out to be wrong. The companies with rolling forecasts were at least already used to changing their numbers every month or every quarter, so at least they had their systems ready for rapid updating. Some people ditch the detailed numbers altogether. What we call top-down strategic planning is where executives, often led by the CFO or the VP of FP&A, somebody in the office of the CFO, they would come up with these revised top-level numbers, and then they would allocate them down. They would say things are happening too rapidly for us to involve tens, hundreds, thousands of people in this process. Let's just take a big number and push it down. The computer-driven planning systems had an interesting year, to put it politely. Computers are really good at making non-biased predictions when what's happening is something they've seen before. No computer in the modern world of budgeting had seen a complete shutdown of the planet. So some of their predictions were wildly off. You saw in some cases, they thought, oh, it's a brief blip at the end of March. It's going to get better in April, and it's going to get better in May. And then when April got worse, and then May got worse, those computers changed from, we think everything is going to regress to the mean. It's going to get looking good. Those computers started factoring in the fact that we were losing 10, 20, 30% of our revenue in a single month. And then they forecasted out with, we're going to be bankrupt in 6 months out, because that was where the trend was going. But don't count out the computers. I actually did some computer modeling myself, some predictive planning in March of 2020. I used it to get a best case, worst case, likely case scenario. And I'm going to show you how those predictions ended up a year later in just a little bit. Oh, the poor zero-based budgeting crowd. They had the problems of bottoms-up budgeting, but even worse, because they had to go back and re-enter all of their data anytime they wanted to revise. Many of the companies following ZBB ended up hating their budgeting systems by year end. They just weren't designed for rapid changing of information. Now, I want to defend ZBB. It had been making a major resurgence before COVID, and I think that's going to come back. ZBB is not inherently bad. What we have to do is we have to take the big lesson of 2020 and say, if we're going to do zero-based budgeting, we have to make it as fast to change as any modern driver-based scenario planning system. Zero-based budgeting, where we don't let last year's numbers affect this year's numbers, that is a great and noble cause. I definitely wouldn't start off planning 2021 by copying over 2020. That is a weird, anomalous year. But we have to take those ZBB systems, we have to make them super rapid, something we can update as quickly as a system that is not zero-based. The continuous planners actually did pretty well. These are the FP&A departments that never close their forecast. They design their planning system for rapid, constant changing. Whenever anything happens, they update their numbers. Second only to scenario planning, continuous planning probably came out one of the big FP&A winning strategies over the last year. So kudos to all of you that were going down the path of continuous planning. Graphical planning was good for seeing trends. To oversimplify graphical planning, it's getting you out of entering grids of numbers and get you looking at what is trending up and what is trending down. The problem with graphical planning, those trends all looked really bad for a while. So we had to assume that they were going to do a V or U-shaped, or God's forbid, an L-shaped type recession. We had to assume those numbers were going to change at some point. Range-based forecasting shot up in popularity over 2020. The problem with range-based forecasting is that while everyone wanted a range from their planning system, 95% of planning systems were created to put in specific numbers, not ranges of numbers. It would not allow you to say, I think the number is going to be between X and Y. It would insist on you narrowing that down to a specific number. Range-based forecasting is critical because we didn't know exactly what the number was going to be, but we had a general idea it was going to be between A and B, between X and Y, between Y and Z. So what we're seeing now are people wanting to add range-based forecasting to their forecasting process. But keep in mind that the biggest problem with adopting range-based forecasting is not a technical one. Any modern planning system will let you do it. It's generally a culture shift issue. The higher up you go in the organization, the more people are expecting a single number. So if you end up doing those ranges, at some point you're going to have to narrow down because somebody wants a column on a spreadsheet that they're going to go share with analysts. So it's a culture shift and not just a technological shift. Oh, poor integrated business planning. Integrated business planning was replaced in 2020 with what I'm going to call totally broken. Don't really care if the systems don't tie because I need a number now, damn it, planning. Or to put it more succinctly, non-integrated business planning. Not since the 80s and early 90s have I seen so many people take their planning system and export it to Excel. And it's because they had developed this really detailed, monotonous, non-value add, not quick to change process. So they export to Excel where they went and made quick numbers, and then they never sent them back in. So we ended up with very, very broken, non-integrated business planning. We've got to go back to a world where we are evaluating and going through the process so that every number affects every later number comes back and affects the earlier numbers. So let's talk about the winner. The real star for 2020, scenario planning. Those who had it in their systems were golden. They started churning out scenarios like they were going out of style. Those who didn't have it quickly tried to figure out how to cram it into their systems that frankly weren't designed to have multiple possible forecasts depending on what might happen at their companies. So I'll give you a little bit of interRel trivia. I'm gonna reveal something to all of you, my close personal friends on this webinar. We were founded at interRel in 1997. We had our highest revenue in our 24-year company history during 2020, during a pandemic. Why? Scenario planning. Everyone that wanted to survive needed it, and they needed it now. Because we all needed to make sure that our companies, our jobs, our livelihoods survived 2020 as we try to keep people alive all around the world. We started off 2020 with a great deal of promise. Oh, it's going to be the Roaring 20s 2.0 with perfect 2020 vision. There was lots of twos and zeros. Just a couple months into this decade, we said, we are going to tell our grandchildren about this someday. And then the global economy got slapped in the face with the reality of we are a global economy. And yet we persevered. How? By reacting quickly. We were right in a way, I guess, that we were going to tell our grandchildren about the 2020s and what we went through. We will tell them how we made it through this year. We will tell them how we survived by reacting in the moment. The world is shockingly good at pivoting when we need to. And FP&A departments led a whole lot of that pivoting within companies as they provided the information lifeline to the whole organization. So once the pandemic became real, every company, or at least every company that's still in business, quickly came up with multiple scenarios for how the impacts of coronavirus would affect the lives of their employees, the lives of their customers, the lives of their business. We took the information they had, which back in March 2020 wasn't very much, and those businesses created financial plans. The average company was creating 3 scenario plans, ranging from short-term recovery to multi-year recession, though we all hope for the best. We're like, we're probably not going to need any of these scenarios. This whole Corona thing will be over by Easter. It's going to be fine. And then it wasn't. So I mentioned earlier that I did 3 computer models back in March of last year. What happened was I went out and surveyed my customer base, which is predominantly Fortune 500. So think of it as companies $1 billion or larger in revenue. So I surveyed those customers, and I found out that most were forecasting around 3 generally different groups of scenarios. The most common scenarios they were planning for all forecasted economic downturn. The difference between the 3 scenarios they were all forecasting was how deep and for how long would that economic downturn last. So I took their scenarios and I had a forecasting model cluster them into 3 probable buckets, 3 different potential recessionary curves. The red curve you see there, and by the way, this is literally my screenshot from March 11th last year. I'm going to show you an updated version in a second. That red curve is the quick recovery. The blue curve is the delayed recovery. The green curve is the prolonged recovery. Both the red and the blue curves are that term I said before. Those are V-shaped recessions, where it's just a matter of how many quarters we go down and how many it takes to go back up. In my green curve, the prolonged contraction, I allowed for more of a what's called a U-shaped recession. So a couple of quarters of decrease and then staying at the bottom for a bit. Some people think of it as like a really ugly, unpleasant bathtub, and then a slow rise. So also maybe jumping into the deep end of the pool, walking along the bottom of the pool, slow, long walk out of the shallow end of the pool. Oh, somebody asked a question. In Oracle planning, can you combine, can you turn on scenario planning with a rolling forecast? The answer is absolutely. It's one of the things the system was designed to do, was kind of let you keep adding those different portions. The most common three things people are turning on right now, I should have answered this question earlier. The three most common things they're turning on right now are rolling forecast with driver-based with scenario planning. If you want to go, yeah, I want to be ahead of the curve, I want to plan much better for the future, turn on those three things: driver-based, rolling forecast, and scenario planning inside of your Oracle EPM cloud. Great question. So most of the economists and the futurists started aligning on those three scenarios I just showed you. They started lining up on those as well. Peter Schwartz in April, he's a futurist, been around for, I don't know, 40, 50 years. And he outlined his three scenarios. And he didn't issue numeric predictions like I did, but he did say it's going to be one of these three general scenarios. He called his first scenario crushing the curve. And it basically aligns with the quick recovery scenario, that red line I showed you on the last slide. It was his best case. It said the governments around the world are going to come in. They're going to prove they actually have some leadership. We're going to shut everything down effectively. We're going to stop it completely. The virus will not spread. We will have this in our rearview mirror by the end of 2020. In my version of the quick scenario, I talked about a decrease in revenue primarily limited to April through July, and then the economy recovering enough that Q3 is still higher revenue than Q2. And by the end of September, right back to where we were at the start of 2020. So think of it as predominantly a quarter decrease, a quarter to get back to normal, and companies would respond to it by maybe we short-term furlough people, maybe we worry about our supply chain, maybe we conserve cash, but we can both take this as an opportunity to reduce our costs, but also to go on the offensive, to maybe attack some of our weaker competitors, because it's short enough that any company with a decent balance sheet can make it through. Now, if this whole predominantly the impact would be April to July, recovering enough in Q3 that Q3 is higher than Q2, this sounds incredibly naive. Pause for a second, realize the majority of the world's companies, some of the finest finance departments on the planet, the majority of the world's economists, everyone talking about the markets thought this was the most likely scenario 11 months ago. So in April, as April began and we got even further into April, this is roughly what they were thinking: a quarter decrease, a quarter recovery. But like most of you, especially in hindsight, Peter and I felt that it was probably going to be a little bit worse than that. Peter's second scenario was actually worse than my second scenario. In his one, Peter Schwartz's likely case, we wouldn't have a vaccine developed until mid-2021, and we wouldn't see GDP growth again until 2022. Now, keep in mind, this was his most likely scenario because this was based on, even if we did Operation Warp Speed, it just takes longer than that to build a vaccine. We don't get a vaccine in 12 months just because we want one. So he was saying, most optimistically, we're probably looking at 18 months until we can get a vaccine produced. And that's when it will start shipping. We're not going to get vaccines around the world till the end of 21 or early 22. My delayed recovery was rosier than Peter Schwartz's. My model showed a decrease in consumer spending for basically 2 quarters. Essentially, we dropped through September and then recovered in Q4 of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021. Under this scenario, you will start seeing bankruptcies. You will start seeing credit issues. You will see a recovery, but you will see both consumer spending and business spending dropping for at least 6 straight months. Basically, under this scenario, we wouldn't be getting a vaccine until the tail end of 2020. It would take longer to produce it and send it out. Companies dealing with this delayed recovery were ones that said, yeah, we're gonna be in this for the long haul. It's gonna be at least a year till we get back to normal. These are the companies that felt this was the most likely scenario that did some aggressive cost reductions. For instance, Carnival Cruise Lines, they went into the coronavirus as a very strong balance sheet. But if you remember, back in the summer, they decided to sell 18 of their ships. And they did that because they said, we think this is going to last longer. If we want to maintain until ships start cruising again, we want to make sure we take some very aggressive cost reductions. Any company planning for a delayed recovery probably was doing layoffs, and they were probably stopping all discretionary spending. They were focusing on cash conservation. A little bit off topic, but I will tell you, companies expecting a delayed recovery did a lot of diving into profitability over the course of 2020. It's really interesting. Companies generally are only concerned with the 20% of products or locations or customers that are costing them 80% of their profitability. They generally only care about that 20% when they're losing money, especially when they start having liquidity issues. When they're making money, nobody wants to look at the portion of their portfolio that's losing them money. Nobody wants to go shut locations down or shut products down or shut ships down when they're not doing very well. People do look at that in times of economic crunch. So we started seeing a lot of people, going back to Oracle EPM, we started seeing a lot of people implement the profitability and cost management portion of Oracle EPM Cloud Enterprise. Peter's third scenario was damn near catastrophic. It basically had the global economy contracting until 2022 or 2023, possibly extending into a recession rivaling the Great Depression. But by the end of 2020, we had a vaccine. We had a few of them, in fact. The fastest the world has ever seen a disease go from being identified to having a vaccine, and some highly effective ones at that. So we are not in a cascading crisis situation. But what really happened? If you reacted by at least making those 3 scenarios, whatever you called them, whatever the duration was, you were a whole lot better off than the companies that went, let's just pull our guidance and hope for the best. Hoping is not a strategy. Waiting is not a physical action. You've got to commit. You've got to say it's going to be these, and we're going to modify these scenarios. Once we start realizing what one is most likely, we're going to have a set of actions ready to enact when that does or does not actually occur. Okay, we're about to do a poll. Don't worry, it's a mental poll. So here's a mental poll for everybody. Pay attention. Which of these 3 scenarios do you think we actually saw? This should be pretty easy for everybody because it already happened. I'm going to break this question into 2 halves to make it even easier for you. I'm going to break it into what happened in the first half of the year. Which of those lines did it align with? So for Q1 and Q2, based on what you heard on the news, what you saw at your company, your own financial research, what you lived through, just say out loud, I think the most likely of these scenarios is, okay. The correct answer for the first half was one of those. It was either quick recovery, delayed recovery, prolonged contraction, or I would have allowed other. It's like, yeah, I think it was better or worse than any of those. Okay, but you said it out loud now, so no take backsies. Here's what we actually saw in the first 2 quarters of the year. That black line is actual USA GDP through the end of June 2020. Essentially, it's the prolonged contraction model. A little bit worse, actually, in Q3. If that's what you said, congratulations, you got the answer right. Now, to be clear, this is USA GDP. I didn't, most of my customer base is headquartered in North America. It's part of the reason I used USA. Another reason I used USA is the Federal Reserve does this really pretty good prediction of where the quarter is going to end up when you're in a quarter. They're really good about releasing GDP numbers. Global GDP is a very lagging indicator. Some countries don't report their GDP until year end. So I had to focus. I could have also done Euro, but I focused on USA GDP. So this chart you're seeing is USA GDP. Now realize there are many, many countries around the world that had the bottom drop out of their economy. The United Kingdom, for instance, had the biggest one-quarter drop in GDP in over 300 years. The Bank of England predicted that their GDP is not going to return to 2019 levels until at least 2023. But did we give up? No. Companies and the economy kept reacting. They kept pivoting. They kept responding in the moment. So now, second part of your verbal poll, your mental poll, predict where the second half of 2020 ended up. So again, say out loud, I think that in the second half of 2021, this was the most likely scenario. This of the three is the one I think we saw for the last half of the year. Okay, ready? Have your mental poll prediction in mind? What we ended up seeing was that the first half of 2020 was very close to the worst case, at least according to my predictive model from last March. But let's hear it for scenario planning. A couple things to note. First of all, that is the textbook definition of a V-shaped recession. Exactly what Harvard Business Review, those economists predicted on March 4th of last year. Fast drop, fast rise. Second of all, shockingly, considering how bad the first half of the year was, notice that what we saw for the Q3 and Q4, it is the poster child for the quick recovery scenario. That one that we all planned for in March of last year ended up being the most correct one for Q3 and Q4 within rounding error. Literally, the Q3 number that I predicted, the model predicted, and what Q3 actually was, were right to within 1/10 of a decimal point. So at 1 decimal point trillion, the Q4 number was off by 0.1 trillion. What that means is that if we had planned for the depths of the prolonged contraction and knew how to control costs, and then we planned for a quick recovery by the end of the year, that number that the quick recovery scenario came up with by the end of the year was actually an accurate one. Now look really closely at your screen, and you're going to see there's a bit of a black dotted line that goes from Q4 2020 to Q1 2021. That's the Fed's GDP Now forecast for Q1. As I said, the Federal Reserve is actually really good about telling you what they think GDP is going to be, and we're already almost at the end of Q1. So that's the GDP's now forecast for Q1. Right now, it's forecasting about 8% growth, which would actually put us 0.1 to 0.2 trillion above the quick recovery scenario. So that red line that we all rather rapidly realized, that's a tongue twister, we all rather rapidly realized was wrong in the first part of the year, actually ends up being the curve that we are on. We are back to a world where the economy is resuming far faster than what we actually expected. So was any one scenario right? Were any of those computer models right? I factored this into the category of wisdom of the masses. When we looked at what everyone's scenarios were, no, not one scenario was right. That economic dip was deeper and faster than 90% of the predictions anyone made. The economic recovery after that massive drop was faster, though, than 99% of the predictions. However, in aggregate, we came up with the right range. We came up with the right range of the first half on prolonged contraction. We came up with the right range for the second half on that quick recovery. The vaccines were developed. They were approved faster than any in history, beating just about everyone's predictions. And now we are on a faster recovery curve than even that heavily mocked quick recovery model that people were talking about back in April of last year. So if you already had scenario planning or you added it in 2020, congratulations. You are on the right track. So keep on scenario planning. Congratulations, that's the right way to go. If you don't have it, add it. If you plan for only one number, you're going to be wrong. If you go, I'm absolutely positive this dart will hit 17 on the dartboard, I will bet against you. It's like, I'll take the opposite side of that bet all day long. I don't care how good of a darts player you are. But if you said, I can see where it could go as low as 1, I can see where it could go as high as 20, I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle, I wouldn't bet against you. Wow, that seems pretty accurate. And if you blow it out of the water and you get a triple 20 or you get a bullseye, congratulations, you beat those scenarios handily. What we have to do, though, is pivot away from what I'm calling reactionary scenario planning. We have to pivot away from things happening to us and then spinning up scenarios as possible outcomes. 2020 was a year of reactionary scenario planning. The CFO of Coca-Cola actually renamed scenario planning. He internally started calling it scenario management because he said it was more about saying, if this scenario happens to us, this is how we will manage it. This is how we will respond. So yes, we were coming up with possible scenarios, but we were only doing it in response to events. We were looking ahead by responding to what already happened. It's kind of like driving your car by looking in the rearview mirror. You have a massive windshield ahead of you. You've got that great big pane of glass to look out through, but we were going, is something chasing me? We were spending all of our time looking in that little rear view. We spent 2020 reacting to the world. Things happened to us. We did not happen to things. But you made it. All of you are here. You are in 2021. Japheth Jev, CFO at Triumph Power and Gas in Nigeria, said in an article on Financial Management News, "We let the management and the board understand that this crisis would definitely affect us, and it was going to affect our customers' business and destroy some of our revenue lines. We assessed the risk and ascertained the level of impact that we are going to suffer." Here's the key part. And we also introduced scenario planning. It's from the CFO of the largest power company in Nigeria. He said, "To be frank, I never appreciated the importance of scenario planning until the advent of COVID-19. But now 2020 is over. And no offense, 2020, but good riddance. We are now planning our scenarios for 2021. We need to pivot from being backward looking about potential scenarios to being proactive about the scenarios that we want to make happen. So take a pause, look ahead, and say, now that the end is in sight, what are the most plausible scenarios for 2021 to 2025? I think if we went beyond 2025, we'd be making things up, but at least we have a bit of visibility to peek through the wall, peek through the veil of that future and say, what do I think is most likely? What is most plausible to occur at least from now till halfway through the decade? Some of the scenarios you came up with might be our company's global expansion. It might be our company's delayed expansion. It might be, let's definitely not expand ever. Whatever those scenarios are, it could be anything from our new products launch well in 2020 to, well, that didn't work. Some of them will be high probability. So start with those. And if you have multiple scenarios within the high probability space, focus on the ones that are higher impact. That is going to allow you to make a strategic shift in your organization. Be aware that the role of the CFO changed dramatically in 2020. At a lot of companies, the CFO's role was one of governance, compliance, standardized reporting, telling everybody this is how you will do it, this is how you won't do it. We must follow this strict, rigid order. Order went out the window in 2020. It's not that chaos reigned, it's that we stopped looking at what had happened and we started looking at what was going to happen. Those CFOs, their role changed from being the person who issued the income statements with actual budget and variance to the company that said, we've done the analysis. Just like I did the models, those offices of the CFOs also did their models, and they said, these are the things that are likely to occur. It's going to be situation A, or it's going to be situation B, or it's going to be situation C. You will find when you look at all the possible scenarios, there are still way too many possible scenarios for you to plan for. So what I advise you to do, group them together into broad categories that cover the 3 to 5 most likely general cases. Then take those scenarios and expand them. So maybe you've got a scenario of, well, what if our products increase revenue by 10%? What if they increase it by 15%? What if they increase it by 20%? Lump that together under a scenario titled, what if our products cause revenue growth? and then go for the middle or go for a range of numbers. But take those general cases and drive them off of KPIs. Definitely make your system KPI driver based. We need them to be easy to revise into full financial plans. But once we've come up with those 3 to 5 scenarios, the office of the CFO, the office of FP&A, the CFO themselves, that job does not stop. Your CFO, she needs to take those plans and communicate them through the organization. She has to make sure that she takes those plans and that every department knows if this scenario occurs, this is the set of actions that we will take to prepare for that scenario. And this is the set of actions we will take to respond to that scenario if it turns out to be reality. You will find that some of your scenarios are abysmal, that if that situation occurs, our organization will be out of business. That is an important scenario to run because you need to understand how to avoid that scenario at all costs. So rather than sit back and wait for somebody else to do it to you, start going, how can I actively make sure this scenario doesn't occur going forward? You've got to take those scenario plans, you've got to circulate them widely. If some of the plans are dire, otherwise known as the start updating your resume scenario, everyone should know what to do to avoid those scenarios. If it's, well, if our new product launch fails, our company's going under. That's important to know. You have to have that set of numbers out there so the entire organization knows we better not let that product launch fail. We have to treat it as the most important initiative we are going to undertake in 2020. Or if it's, wow, if our product launch takes off wildly, we are going to be the dominant company in our industry. Get everyone on board for that. Take whatever actions you have to take ethically to make sure that scenario is the one that occurs. Now, while I am uplifting and hopeful for 2020 through 25, I'm extremely happy about the economic recovery. Some countries are delayed in that recovery. Other countries are even more accelerated out of it. We will take all those various numbers, and sadly, we do have to plan for the downside. While you're doing your scenario planning, you should probably throw in a worst case scenario. I don't want you all to think that we're going to have many, many pandemics in our future, but in the words of the great Cylon prophets, all this has happened before. All this will happen again. Or to put it a different way, because I can't act, if the world can figure out a way to frack everything up, it probably will. There will be another catastrophic event. So take the time now to plan for how you'll respond to it so that you're not reacting in the moment, that you are the most prepared organization of any in your entire industry. This year, 2021, it is time to take control back. It is time to take our plans and make them not reactive plans, but proactive plans. We are going to make 2021 the year where things don't happen to you. We're going to make 2021 the year where you go out and happen to things. Joe Altman and I are holding a free, yes, free, 3-hour scenario planning workshop on March 30th. This is for customers, prospective customers alike. Feel free to come along. We are going to help figure out how to make 2021 a year where you go out and happen to things. If this sounds of interest to you, if you want to find out how I can take that scenario planning to the next level, maybe your current system doesn't allow for scenarios, or it doesn't allow for ranges, or you want to go from being pandemic backward looking reactionary scenario planning to proactive scenario planning. If you're interested, register for the workshop at epm.bi/planning. That's epm.bi/planning. Again, it's free. Just something I'm trying to do because I want all of you to be here in 2022. I want all of you thriving from now through 2025 and beyond. And to do that, we are all going to have to work together. It is time that the world, starting with all of you, took its power back from the virus. Everyone, thank you for joining me for the last 45 minutes. I want you to go out and make 2021 the best year ever, because it certainly can't be worse than 2020. And now I'm the guy that jinxed it. Thank you all. I appreciate the last 45 minutes of your life. Let's go out and start happening to things. Thanks, everybody.